When this war began 8 months ago, many countries around the world had vowed to sever their economic ties with Russia. The entire focus of Western-imposed sanctions was to cripple the Russian economy after it invaded Ukraine. But as one of the world's most important producers of oil and gas, Russia has had long-standing and rather lucrative trade partnerships around the world. Countries are now finding that breaking those trade ties are not all that easy. Russia has gone on to keep large parts of its trading relationship pretty much intact despite this war. In fact, in the year 2020, much before this war began, Russia imported over $200 billion of products from the rest of the world. Now, much of this included cars, auto parts, medicines, computers. The principal sellers to Russia happened to be China, Germany, and Korea. The volume of Russia's imports has plunged somewhat in the last 8 months since this war began. Sanctions and trade limits have gone into effect, but a few countries, including China and Turkey, have only deepened their trade relationship with Russia since this war began. So on Crux DeCode, why has the West failed to isolate Russia and its trading partnerships? Why can't the rest of the world get enough of Russian oil and gas? And are high oil prices actually helping Russia fund its war chest? Now, many countries have found that living without Russian raw materials, particularly oil and gas, are incredibly difficult. More than 2/3 of Russia's exports before this war were oil and gas. This runs the world's cars, trains, and aeroplanes. It also keeps homes warm. It keeps factories running. That has led to a frustrating reality for many Western countries who were hoping to undercut Russia by punishing its economy. The irony is this, that the value of Russian exports has actually grown in the last 8 months after it invaded Ukraine. Russia's relationship with the world is continuing to evolve rather rapidly. The Observatory for Economic Complexity, which is an online data platform, has put out Russia's trade data over the last 9 months. Now, because this data is published with a lag, the picture that you're going to see is actually seen in hindsight. Russia's ability to trade with the rest of the world could be further curtailed going forward in the coming months as the Western world introduces newer sanctions against Russia. But so far, the data that's been put out by this think tank, it underscores how deeply intertwined Russia and its economy is with the rest of the globe's economy. Attempts by Western nations to try and use sanctions as well as price caps to try and cripple Russia's economy, so far at least, have had very limited effects. It's very difficult, as the rest of the world has figured out, to live without Russian resources. This is according to Sergei Alexashenko, who is a former deputy finance minister of Russia and the deputy chairman of Russia's central bank. He says there is simply no substitute to Russian raw material. So as this war drags on and the world's response to it is bringing about a remarkable change in international trade flows. Food, for example, is in short supply in many countries in the global south, whether that's in Asia, Africa, and in Latin America. Prices for fuel products have risen across the United States as well as Europe. In fact, American consumers are paying up to $4 a gallon, which is a barometer for high gas prices. And Russia's long-standing economic ties with Europe too are gradually getting unknotted. Russia is rather ingenuously rearranging its trading alliances. Newer countries are coming in to pick up the pace that's been slacked by Europe. The European Union and the United States have both imposed very harsh economic penalties on Russia. It has sanctioned hundreds of Russia's wealthy citizens and government officials. They've also largely succeeded in cutting off Russia from the international financial system. Both the US and Europe have vowed to stop sending advanced technology as well as banned Russian airlines from flying to Western destinations. Decisions by global multinational companies to halt their operations in Russia, that also has had a major impact. In fact, container ships that are filled with foreign goods are no longer streaming into the St. Petersburg port, which happens to be a main point of connection with the rest of the world. and inflation and economic uncertainty are causing Russian consumers to cut back on buying daily necessities, leave alone luxuries. But sanctions on Russian oil and gas have been slower to take effect. The United States has already cut off purchases of Russian oil. The UK will be doing so by the end of the year. But neither country is a major buyer of Russian oil. The European Union, which is heavily dependent on Russian energy, is already struggling with inflation. Europe has stopped importing Russian coal back in August. It is going to ban all Russian crude oil imports starting December and all petroleum products from February of next year. Russia, in turn, has banned some of its own exports, including agricultural exports and medical products. Oil and gas are Russia's most important exports by far and a major source of government funding. The high price of oil and gas over the last year or so, that has inflated the value of Russia's exports. In fact, it has helped Moscow offset a huge amount of revenues that have been lost because of sanctions. In fact, Gazprom, which is the state-run energy giant, the biggest energy giant in Russia, it posted a record profit for the first half of this year. The International Monetary Fund has repeatedly revised its forecast for the Russian economy for this year, saying it would contract by much less than what was initially predicted. The IMF had said in October that it expected the Russian economy to shrink by just 3.4%. That is a contraction that is much smaller than the 6% that it had forecast back in July. At the time that this war began, the IMF had forecast that the Russian economy would shrink by as much as 8.5% to 10%, but that has not been the case. Russia has withstood the economic sanctions better than anticipated, aided by this high price of oil and gas. The new bans on oil and petroleum products that European countries are going to introduce between December and February, that could represent a major loss for Russia. But the oil that leaves Russia, instead of going to Europe, will likely go to new markets. Since the invasion of Ukraine, India and China have emerged as much bigger buyers of Russian oil. In turn, the countries that used to sell more to these, that is India and China, countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or the UAE, will now potentially start selling more oil to Europe. So that is going to lead to a global reshuffling in the energy market. Russian oil, instead of being completely banned, is going to be merely diverted to new markets like India and China rather than being completely cut off from the international oil markets. So how much money Russia will ultimately generate from its oil sales, that remains unclear. As demand for its products elsewhere has fallen, Moscow is now being forced to sell its oil to India and China at discounted prices. Western countries are now trying to introduce a price cap that will further limit how much revenue Moscow can earn from every single barrel of oil that's been sold. So far, higher energy prices have offset the negative effects. Prices for benchmark oils like Brent and Urals have fallen in recent months, but because energy prices were elevated for much of this year, Russia actually received more money from oil and gas in dollar terms between March and July this year compared to last year. But this is how it seems in the rearview mirror, but the road ahead could be much more bumpy.